Hi. I'm playing this synth through an effects chain that's a floor above and on the other side of the house with under 4 milliseconds of latency, and everything's running on an Ethernet cable that I had installed over 10 years ago. And using MIDI over the same cable, I can swap presets or just play any synth downstairs. And edit its parameters all over MIDI. So, if you've got slightly too much gear scattered in different places in your house or studio, and you wish everything was just plugged in and immediately playable with any effects routing order you like, even if it isn't in the same room, this series of videos may be for you. In the previous video in this series, I looked at analog matrix mixers and routers. In this video, I'll explore the pros and cons of using digital audio matrix routers, whether it's inside a mixer, audio interface, or using network routers like Dante, including inexpensive ways of combining instruments in different places in your house or studio as if they were all one setup with minimal wiring, to the extent of dozens of audio and MIDI channels running on a single network cable. Before I start, a quick disclosure: some of the gear you'll see in this video was sent to me for free, some I bought at a discount, and some I paid full price for. Regardless, no manufacturer has say over the content of my videos. The bulk of the funding for this channel comes from people who subscribe to my book updates on Patreon, including all the tips in this series, as well as my other videos, plus plenty of other bonus content. One small thing before we get into the world of digital matrix solutions. I won't repeat what was said in my previous video. If you didn't watch it, please do. I'll just say briefly that you might be able to solve all your routing needs with a simple, cheap analog Patchbay. See plenty of Patchbay tips in my previous video. Or an analog matrix mixer like the one by Synths. Again, see my previous video for more info. This one isn't that cheap, but it's still way less expensive than a digital mixer or audio interface with 16 inputs and outputs, which this has. Analog mixers and Patchbays also have the advantage of having zero latency, as opposed to using a digital mixer or interface, which may introduce slight latency, or potentially quite a bit, if you go through a computer and DAW. If you start introducing multiple digital devices, you also might have to deal with digital clocking issues, things analog doesn't need to bother with. By the way, Erica's Matrix I/O isn't balanced, but analog Patchbays and most interfaces are, which is important if your setup is susceptible to noise. That said, most effects pedals and many instruments aren't balanced either, so based on what you've got, having a balanced mixer may be irrelevant. Okay, one of the most important things you need to ask when you think of a digital hub for a setup is the main brain going to be a mixer or an audio interface? Traditionally, the answer would be simple. You use a mixer to create a live mix and an audio interface to get audio into your computer and record it into your DAW. However, these days, many digital mixers are also multi-channel audio interfaces, and many interfaces also have very capable low-latency latency mixers built in that you can use without a computer. They just don't come with a physical mixing interface. Instead, you use either software or MIDI controllers to control the mix on the interface itself. So, for example, interfaces from Universal Audio have a built-in low-latency mixer and plenty of DSP effects, but you can only control them remotely using their UA console software. Same goes for RME. You may think you're looking at just an audio interface, but there's a mixer inside controlled remotely by software called Total Mix. Some of these interfaces give you a few minimal controls on the panel. The H9000 that I chose as the main brain for my setup comes at a steep price, but has the best of both worlds, both full onboard controls for routing and effects, and remote control using Eventide's Emote software. I'll talk about pros and cons for the H9000 later. Anyway, the bottom line is, if your interface has a built-in hidden mixer, which not all do, especially the less expensive ones with a lower channel count, you can still use it as a low-latency digital mixer, even if it's not connected to your computer. So if you don't need immediate access to various multiple mixer parameters like EQ, levels, and sends, or just don't want to give up the desktop real estate for them, an audio interface with a built-in mixer might be a good choice for you. I know that personally, that's what I prefer. So how do you choose? Let's go through a few things you need to consider. First and foremost, I think it's Ease of use versus desktop real estate. Mixers are certainly easier to use. The additional downside of mixers is that you're usually paying for these additional controls, not only in desktop real estate, but also the cost of the controls, knobs, faders, and so on themselves. The next thing to check is available channels. If you decide to go for a mixer, beware that not all mixers with a USB port will expose all their channels to your computer. Some only output a stereo mix over USB. You'll have more flexibility if you pick a mixer that's also a multi-channel audio interface, not just a stereo one. If you decide to give up the hands-on controls of a mixer, then when you look at interfaces, check to see that the interface you buy has MIDI mapping options. This way, if you do want hands-on control for various mixer parameters or effect parameters, you can easily map them to an external controller. This kind of mapping lets you choose exactly which physical controls you want to allocate desktop real estate to. A quick tip here, many instruments also send MIDI control information when you move their faders and knobs. Some have dedicated MIDI tracks. For example, the Digitone and Digitakt have dedicated MIDI tracks. This means that, say in the case of the Digitone or Digitone, you've got a 32 knob MIDI controller built in that you can use to control any mixer parameter that's mappable to MIDI. Now, even if your audio interface doesn't have a built-in mixer at all, or its mixer features are too basic, you could still use your DAW as a matrix mixing console, not just as a mixer. The main disadvantage of using a DAW as a matrix mixer, meaning sending audio back and forth through external gear, is latency. If you've got a stronger computer, you could explore smaller buffer sizes to reduce latency. Notice that sometimes going all the way to a small buffer doesn't really improve things. So here, for some reason, 32 samples and 64 samples gives us the same latency. You could try increasing the sample rate, which will reduce latency. It will require more CPU power and more storage, but it could work. Anyway, assuming this isn't an issue for you, or you don't plan to make too many hops back and forth, then a DAW can be an excellent matrix router to external gear. If your DAW has devices to help you with that, then your life will be much easier. For example, in Ableton Live, if we wanted to add an external insert effect to a track, then you'd just take the external audio effect and drag it onto the track you wanted. And this takes care of everything, including hardware latency if it has any. And if you wanted to use an external effect not as an insert effect, but as a send effect, just drag it onto one of the return tracks, and then you can send audio from different tracks to that at different levels. You can also make matrix-style routings by choosing source audio coming into a track from one of the external inputs, or by sending a track to other internal tracks, and you can also listen to other internal tracks. So plenty of routing options here. When you do listen to a track, be mindful of whether you're listening pre-effects, post-effects, and pre-fader or post-fader. Another advantage of using your DAW as a matrix router and as a mixer generally is that most DAWs pair nicely with external controllers. So you can either map manually or choose one of the many pairing options for your DAW, giving you a lot of flexibility regarding how much desktop real estate you want to allocate to the mixing portion of your setup. The next thing to consider, the number of inputs and outputs and preamps. Preamps can dramatically increase the cost of a mixer or interface, and generally speaking, mixers tend to be heavy on preamps compared to audio interfaces with the same number of inputs and outputs. Now, of course, if you plan to record with a lot of microphones, you'll need a lot of preamps, but if you've got synths and effects, you don't need preamps. Some interfaces come with a blend of both. So for example, AudioFuse Studio has 4 preamps and another 4 line inputs in the back. One important thing to look for if you're planning to record high impedance instruments, electric guitars or basses, also be aware that 1/4-inch inputs aren't necessarily high Z or instrument level inputs unless it says so in the specs or on the panel. You can still plug an electric guitar or bass into a line input, but it might impact your tone if it's not a high Z input. Another important consideration is whether your interface or mixer has balanced inputs and outputs. Balanced audio helps solve noise issues, but only if the inputs and outputs on your instruments are also balanced. If this is the case, you need to be sure you're using balanced cables, meaning TRS, tip ring sleeve cables, as opposed to only tip sleeve cables or XLR cables. Speaking of I/O types, I recommend mixers/interfaces with combo inputs and outputs so that you can use either XLR or TRS cables. If you get a mixer or interface with just one or the other, prepare to spend more on adapters or cables that have an XLR tip on one end and a TRS tip on the other. Besides direct individual analog inputs and outputs, mixers and interfaces may come with other types of I/O or adding additional channels. Be sure to check if your mixer or interface are expandable. It's always an advantage. ADAT is a popular light-based port with which you can expand an interface. Each single ADAT port can carry up to 8 mono channels in or out at rates of up to 48 kilohertz, and some interfaces let you carry 4 mono channels at 96 kilohertz per ADAT port. Some interfaces come with 2 pairs of ADAT ports. This doesn't always mean that you can expand them with double the inputs and outputs. Sometimes these 2 pairs are only there to let you run 8 channels of 96 kilohertz audio instead of just 4. AES and SPDIF are also common digital ports on many interfaces. Some interfaces, like in my setup, the H9000 or the RedNet A8R, come with DB25 inputs and outputs. These are used to carry up to 8 balanced inputs and outputs, and to access these with regular TRS quarter-inch cables, you'll need to buy a DB25 adapter. This one from Hoza is pretty affordable. Some mixers and interfaces support other connectivity and networking formats. Popular ones are MIDI, AVB, and Dante. More on that in a bit. If you plan to explore modular gear, you may want to check whether your interface supports DC-coupled outputs and at what voltage range. I'm not aware of any interfaces with DC-coupled inputs other than those by expert sleepers. Let me know in the comments section if you're familiar with others. Next, being class compliant is one not so obvious feature that's good to find in an audio interface. This means that it doesn't need any dedicated drivers to interface with your computer, and you don't need to worry that upgrading your operating system will break the connection with your interface. This also means that you can use it with an iPad or other gear that doesn't support third-party drivers like MPC or Maschine. Some interfaces have the best of both worlds, a class-compliant mode and a faster proprietary driver mode. Let's talk about onboard DSP processing. Many mixers and some audio interfaces come with built-in effects, anything from EQ all the way to effects like compressors, delays, and reverbs. Some audio interfaces come with more sophisticated DSP effects, for example, like auto-tune on the universal audio interfaces, or fancy pitch shifting and space DSP algorithms like on the H9000. In the past, part of the reasoning behind buying an audio interface with DSP effects was to offload CPU power to the interface. If you buy a modern computer, that may be less of a consideration. These days, DSP effects may be relevant if you want to work without a computer, or if low latency is important while recording and tracking, or in the rare case that certain hardware has special effects that you can't get on a computer, or analog external effects. If you're going for the DSP effects heavy machines, be aware of whether you need to spend more money to buy additional effects beyond what came with your interface. One of the reasons, by the way, that I picked the H9000 is that you get access to its, I think, over 1,500 different effects. They all come bundled with the machine. It does cost a lot, but at least you don't need to pay extra. Another consideration for the H9000 was that you can take a peek at any one of its algorithms, so you can download them all to your computer. And if you want to take a look at the structure of a complex or simple effect, you can edit these or create your own. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's nice that this exists, especially since this enables third parties to develop new algorithms. One more consideration that may be important to you when deciding to get an audio interface versus a mixer is multi-track recording direct to USB or an SD drive. We're increasingly seeing this feature on mixers, not so much on interfaces. If that feature is important to you, make sure you get a mixer with multi-track recording, because some record only the final stereo mix. Another difference between mixers and audio interfaces is that mixers are typically low on the number of outputs you've got. You need separate outputs to route audio to different external effects. Now, I think it makes sense to have fewer outputs than inputs. Based on my experience, you're accepting way more audio than you'll end up sending out to effects. I think a 2-to-1 ratio is enough, but most mixers don't give you that. When you have so many outputs, it may be a bit of a hassle to deal with sends. Many interfaces will give you matrix routers like the one you see here. Typically, sources are on top and destinations are on the left. It's also easy to create effects chains in this type of grid, routing from sources to destinations in a circular fashion back and forth. The challenge with most implementations of grids that I've seen is that they don't let you set the levels of nodes in the grid, and you typically can't connect more than one source to a single destination or split a single source to multiple destinations. This is where Erica's matrix gets a nice shout out. You can set 3 node levels and you can connect as many sources and destinations to each other as you want. So dear interface manufacturers, please give us more control. Be like Erica. Another type of matrix router you might encounter is one where the sources are on top and destinations are on the bottom. This is the emote interface for the H9000. You just enable the ports you want, and make the connections this way. With the H9000, by the way, you can connect a single source to multiple destinations, but you can't connect multiple destinations to a single source. You do that using a mixer. The H9000 works a little bit differently from other interfaces, so I'll talk about this later. What you'll typically get in an audio interface is a mixer, either in parallel to a matrix router or without one, like in the case of AudioFuse Studio here. So in the case of AudioFuse Studio, you've got 3 possible mixes. You could use one, say, as your main mix and 2 others to send to external effects. Once you're done creating your different mixes, you choose which outputs you want to send them to. More sophisticated mixers may have aux sends per channel, and if your interface includes internal effects, you might find an EQ, compressor, delay, and reverb effects. This is the channel strip on the Motu Ultralight Mark IV. By the way, you may see USB and analog sources on these. It's a bit confusing at first. Analog sources or destinations are the physical inputs and outputs on your interface. If you're not using a computer or DAW, you can ignore the USB I/O entirely. However, if you do use a DAW, it only sees the USB I/O part of your matrix interface. A DAW doesn't actually see the physical ports, just the USB ones. So when you're looking at grids like these, you won't hear anything from your DAW unless you connect the USB audio sources to actual outputs, and you won't be able to record unless you connect the analog inputs to the USB I/O. Most interfaces are set up with these connections by default, but be careful not to clear them, otherwise you won't understand why you're not able to record or not able to send audio out to your speakers. Okay, that pretty much sums up the discussion of mixers versus audio interfaces. Let's zoom out a bit. What if you've really got too much gear and can't fit it all in one room? For example, in my case, I've put my relatively small synths in this setup on the ground floor of my house where I also work and make these videos, but I've got, let's say, maybe 1 or 2 more larger synths that won't fit in this room and are in the basement. What if I wanted to use all these lovely effects when I'm in the basement, or perhaps wanted to get the sounds of the synths in the basement while I'm sitting here? MIDI can't make that distance over cables, and I'm not going to run 8 or 10 audio cables through the walls of my house. Fortunately, these days you can send plenty of audio in MIDI over a single Ethernet cable. Wiring Ethernet through existing pipes in your walls shouldn't be too hard, and as luck would have it, that's actually something I had done a few years back when we moved in this house. As far as MIDI goes, there's an open standard for moving MIDI over Ethernet. It's called RTP MIDI. It's actually supported natively in macOS and on iOS devices. And if you want to connect to a location without a computer or an iOS device, a company called iConnectivity makes 2 products that are both MIDI routers and support RTP or network MIDI. So you can connect their interfaces to anywhere you want on your network and get both DIN MIDI and USB MIDI, and you can, like I did, interface one of these devices on one edge of the network with a computer on the other. iConnectivity also makes software you can download for free that lets you run RTP MIDI over Windows. There's a much bigger story to their boxes. Inside is actually a full-blown Matrix MIDI router. If you saw my previous Matrix setup video, you'll know that I used, and still do, use Conductive Labs MRCC as the Matrix MIDI hub for my upstairs setup. I still think MRCC is great for hands-on MIDI routing, but if you prefer a Matrix MIDI router that can be controlled remotely, then MioXL and MioXM can do very similar things, including RTP MIDI, which MRCC can't. I already covered MRCC's interface briefly in my previous video. Just to complete the picture, here's a quick tour of MioXL or MioXM's interface. You make MIDI connections in the MIDI routing page. Here, sources are on the left and destinations are on the right. So for example, I connected RTP1 as a source to Trigon 6, and that's how I control that remotely. And I also wanted to feed MIDI back from Trigon 6 to the RTP MIDI connection. So that's how you create matrix routings here. Like MRCC, they also have a bunch of filter and remapping options. You can also save presets here, and this page is where you control the various RTP network MIDI connections. You can see I've got a connection here to this Mac. I've got another one in case I want to connect to a different device. You make RTP connections in the network setup section of Audio MIDI Studio. You can see I've got 2 of them here. This one isn't active, this one is. And once you've got that set up, if I hop into Ableton Live, then I can control anything in the basement just by sending MIDI to this device. One thing to note about RTP MIDI, it works really nicely with relatively low latency over a wired network, but I also tested it over Wi-Fi and things were much more unreliable there. Notes can get dropped, and unlike when I play wired, latency is very noticeable. By the way, there's an alternative proprietary network MIDI protocol by Bohm that claims to have better performance. I haven't tried it yet, but from personal knowledge, these people know what they're doing when it comes to MIDI. They do charge licenses per endpoint, so it's not free, but it's not that expensive. And if you want to connect with hardware, they've got the Bohm box, so you don't need to be reliant on a computer or iOS device. Another thing you might want to explore in the context of a wired or wireless network is Ableton Link. While you can't send notes or control messages from place to place using Ableton Link, it works really well for transport and clock sync. And while Link was developed by Ableton, you don't need to use Ableton Live with it at all. There are a whole bunch of platforms, apps, and hardware that support Ableton Link. So if you want to sync multiple devices or apps on a network, this is well worth a look. So that's it for network, MIDI, transport, and clock. What about networked audio? There are a few open and proprietary platforms for this. Open source ones include AVB and AES67, and Dante is a proprietary protocol developed by a company called Audinate. All of these are designed to work on wired networks, not wireless, with very low latency. Now, while in general I prefer to use open standards like MIDI when possible, AVB requires that you use a proprietary switch. I've got about 7 regular switches already installed in my house, so that's a no-go for me. AVB also doesn't seem to be supported by nearly as many companies as Dante, which means fewer hardware options, though AVB is supported by Motu, Presonus, and Apple, which are serious companies. But like I mentioned, what sealed the deal for me was the enormous number of devices that support Dante, the fact that it can run on regular switches, you don't need any special switches for it, and the fact that you can get up and running relatively quickly with software. So let me explain. Dante hardware works at extremely low latency rates. Device latency over a network is measured here in microseconds, not milliseconds. But if you want to get started with software and don't mind a bit of extra latency, Audinate offers 2 different software products depending on what you want to do. If you want to just send and receive audio from and to a computer, use Dante Sound Card. Depending on your CPU, you can choose how many ins and outs you want and decide the latency, again, based on CPU power. Minimal latency is 4 milliseconds, which isn't that bad. And then you can receive and send audio from and to a Dante network with your computer. And then the second product is Dante AVIO. This turns any audio interface connected to your computer to a Dante device. Now you need to be connected to a network for this to work. I've got this adapter, and let's hook up a network to it and the adapter to my computer. And then if I hit start, then things should magically start working. Now there's a separate app called Dante Controller that lets you see what's going on in your network. So for example, here on top are my sources. This is the H9000. This is the A8R in the basement. We'll talk about this guy in a bit. And then this is my Mac. And you can expand any of these. And you can see I've got both Chrome available as an app here as a source and my built-in microphone on the Mac. Now, if I take an audio interface, I happen to have one here, which also happens to be a mixer, but let's ignore that for a second, and connect that, let's turn it on, and connect that via USB to my computer. So you can see that now all these channels have been added as sources that I can route around to the H9000 or to the A8R, to the basement. And of course, I can route things back and forth to here as well, to this Mac as well. So from the basement or from the H9000 into any one of these outputs over here. By the way, you make connections using this Dante controller software, but once you've made a connection, then the controller or the computer doesn't need to be on for sources that aren't connected to this computer. The next step up in cost, if you want to connect to a Dante network and don't want to use a computer, is probably these Dante AVIO adapters made also by Audinate. This one is the analog output adapter. So you connect this to a wired network and you get 2 outputs that you can connect to. And if you don't have XLR adapters, then you can use these to hook up to TRS. This is the output version, and I've got the input version across the room connected here. So that gives you 2 sources, 2 channels, channel 1 and 2, that you can connect to anywhere you want. So say if I wanted to connect 2 inputs from this room to the RedNet A8R in the basement, make connection 1, connection 2, takes about a second, and when you see the green check marks, that's it. You can close the software. This or that connector over there is now connected to the basement. These connections, by the way, survive restarts of any of these devices. So if I was to disconnect this or turn this off and then turn them back on, then these devices would magically find themselves and connect to each other. One caveat about these, by the way, you need to connect them to a PoE or powered over Ethernet switch. They don't have any power input. They get their power through the Ethernet cable. A few more things about the Dante controller app. This is where you'll be spending most of your time with this app. There are a few other tabs that show you status of various devices and how they're connected to the network. You can see my lame 100 megabit per second switch in the basement. I did have a couple of issues with this. First was clocking. Initially, I got pops every 30 seconds or so, and that was because my H9000 wasn't set to follow Dante clock, so make sure you do that. The network decides who's leader and follower, I guess on its own, depending on what's going on, but you can override that if you want. So I could set, for example, the basement A8R to be the preferred leader, and it'll switch that. I actually didn't need to mess with this, but one thing that I did need to do, if you drill down to the individual devices, then initially my AVIO input didn't work well. It had a lot of noise, and that's because in the controls, it defaulted to 24 dBu. You need to change that based on the device you're plugging into it, balanced or unbalanced. So apart from those two issues, so far everything has been working fine with very low latency, which I think is quite miraculous considering the number of things that can go wrong. Anyway, the end result for me is that my upstairs setup and my basement setup can basically be treated as one, and I can route any of the inputs or outputs downstairs to any of the inputs or outputs up here. Ignore the computer, I just did this for demo purposes, but typically it's just the Eventide H9000 and A8R, and it just works really nicely. When I'm upstairs, I can send MIDI downstairs and play the instruments there and hear them upstairs. If the downstairs synth happens to have control software, like the Trigon 6 in this case, I can also control its parameters from right here upstairs, swap presets, and so on as if I was downstairs. A full round trip for the audio takes about 4 milliseconds going through effects. And for MIDI a bit longer, I think maybe around 8 milliseconds. And then same goes for when I'm downstairs. I can play my synth here, run it through the upstairs effects, hear the audio back down here with minimal latency. Now most effects pedals I have upstairs don't have MIDI control, so I can get a good workout if I want to change their knobs. But luckily, increasingly, pedals do have MIDI control, and the H9000 is totally remote controllable via Wi-Fi using their emote software. So if I bring my laptop downstairs, I can swap algorithms or swap entire effects chains. Here we go. All remotely. Speaking of the H9000, what is it and is it worth it? First, I feel like I need another disclosure here. I got it at a steep discount from Eventide. It still cost me thousands of dollars, both paid direct to them and import fees and customs. And as usual, they have no say over the content of this video. Anyway, the H9000 has the DSP power of 16 Eventide H9s or 8 H90s, but that's not why I bought it. What makes it special, I think, is that unlike the H9 or H90 that come with 50 or 60 algorithms, like I mentioned earlier, this comes with hundreds or actually over 1,500 of them. These are algorithms that Eventide have been building for years. They run, I think, on the H8000 as well, so they've been around for a while, and they've slowly accumulated to a mass of this endless list, which you can get lost in some of these for hours. And then there are also a few effects chains that you can drag and drop and replace. So these are combinations of up to 4 algorithms with different serial or parallel routings. And you can run up to 4 of these chains, so up to 16 algorithms at once. Now there are 2 versions of the H9000, one with the display and the H9000R, which is $2,000 cheaper without the display. Both can do exactly the same thing and sound the same. It's just that you need to configure the 9000R with the emote software as opposed to the H9000, which lets you configure everything on the front panel as well. Now, that said, even though the front panel isn't too menu divey, I found myself going back to the software because it's much faster than the panel, and you always have a big picture of what's going on. These are your effects chains, these are the algorithms within a particular effect, and these are the individual controls for an algorithm. So you click an algorithm and you see its parameters here. By the way, these colorful algorithms are ones that will have come from the H9, H90, or Eventide's space and factor pedals. The ones that don't look like colorful pedals are all the ones that you don't get on the commercial pedals. You may recall I mentioned earlier that you can't connect more than one source to a single destination, to a single physical output on the H9000. If you want to do that, you'll need to use one of the mixer algorithms, which you can search for. There actually aren't that many built in, but luckily a fellow called Jason from Godlike Productions makes a few, both free and premium ones for sale. And let's say drag and drop one of these in here. So this is a stereo summing mixer with drive. And remember, you can map these to anything you want, any controller you want externally. So pretty cool in terms of pros and cons for the H9000. Pros for me are the algorithms that you just can't get anywhere else, including not on the H90, and just the ease of using it as a main hub or brain for a large multi-room setup. I showed this earlier, but it's just as easy to bring in analog ADAT USB sources as it is for Dante sources. You can store sessions and they can get pretty complex pretty quickly. The most obvious con is its price. It's super expensive. And then one big wish list feature that I have is the option to rename inputs and outputs. I've got quite a lot going on here. It's hard to remember what's connected to what. I don't want to deal with notes. I just want to see what each device is right up here. I also had a few bugs and crashes in the software and in the hardware. Maybe it's because I'm on the new beta. These are very rare, happen I think maybe after many, many hours of use, and a restart solves them, but hopefully they'll fix that in the future. Overall, I love it, but if you don't feel you need to access the exclusive effects chains and algorithms that this comes with, it's much cheaper to get an H90 or even much cheaper to get a used H9 Max. If you want a taste of the Eventide sound, yes, these have only 50 or 60 algorithms as opposed to the over 1500 on the H9000, but there's still quite a lot to explore on these. So now that we know how everything works, let's take a quick look at this setup and a few lessons we can learn from it. Locally upstairs, I've got 8 digital inputs and outputs on the H9000, and I expanded that with ADAT with the AudioFuse 8 Pre. 4 of the inputs on 8 Pre are routed to Hydrasynth and Magnetismus for end-of-chain processing, and then all the other inputs are connected to the Patchbay on top. I also hooked up 6 analog outputs from the H9000 and made them accessible on the Patchbay to use as sends for external effects. The rest of the outputs on top are for audio coming in from various sources, including the good old Erica Matrix, which I still use as a Patchbay for gear on the left side of the setup. This saved me the trouble of getting an additional Patchbay or interface. Most of the rest of the bottom row on the Patchbay is used for the inputs of various effects. Speaking of the Patchbay, I already talked about how Patchbays worked in my previous video, so I won't repeat it here. I'll just say again how much I recommend this one from Samson, which lets you change patch modes right up front on the panel, which I do a lot. I'll also say that I'm committing 2 major Patchbay offenses here. First, I'm using a jack on the bottom row as an output because I ran out of outputs on top. And then to add insult to injury, I'm also taking advantage of the fact that this is a balanced Patchbay to get a stereo signal from Mood and Genloss using a single TRS cable because they use a TRS cable for their stereo signal. This means that to actually pick up the stereo signal from the Patchbay, I'd need a TRS insert cable to plug that into the output and then use these 2 cables as left and right sources back into the H9000. Almost needless to say, when you're pulling off these Patchbay crimes, make sure to switch the Patchbay module to through mode. So that's it for this video. You'll find all the tips and ideas from this video as well as all my other videos in my ever-expanding book available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful. Click the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching. Thank you.